German Green Party and spokesperson for climate. Thank you both for coming on the programme. Jess, can I start with you? Is it the fact then that the least prosperous regions of Europe, the old industrial heartland, are the places that will face the greatest disruption as we try and meet these targets?
Well, none of the evidence points to that, actually. When you look at what's happened with the UK steel industry, obviously here to talk about Port Talbot, that's been in decline long before net zero emissions by 2050 was even a thing. So it's been a long-term decline, basically, of this industry. And of course, there's places in the northwest of England as well, where they're facing long-term industrial decline. And that's really meant that lots of people in the sector, in the industrial sector, have been calling for quite a while for a long-term strategy for our industries, because at present, it doesn't really seem like we have one. It seems like a piecemeal 500 million, like you mentioned, to Tata, some money towards the Scunthorpe plant as well. But there's not really an overall coordinated approach to our industry. And that means that, unfortunately, we're going to get more and more reliant on imports of things like steel.
Right, I'm going to come back to that because it's a really important thought. Michael, let me pick this up with you, because there's a similar concern about steelmaking in Germany. The CEO of ArcelorMittal said in an email statement just a few weeks ago that the funding for the green transition of its steel plants, that's about half of a planned 2.5 billion euro investment, is now hanging in the balance. And that's because of the pressure on public finances. And a lot of people look at you, the Green Party, and blame you for that, because you've pushed the transition, but the money isn't there to deliver on what you've promised.
Well, we pushed the transition, but the transition itself is also pushed by industry, because it's clear that there needs to be a differentiation. Europe will produce a better steel than, for instance, is produced in India, but for this we need to modernize our industry. So what we are doing, we are replacing the blast furnaces with green direct reduction plants. But it seems to me that the case that you were discussing and is happening right now in the UK is not quite similar to what we are doing in Germany, because it seems to me that you are decreasing industrial output, but the whole idea of the green transition in Germany is that we keep the industrial output, but reducing the CO2 emissions.
OK. There is, though, a dangerous political element to this, though, isn't there, Michael? I was looking at a report from the German Economic Institute. They say the number of voters for the far-right AfD, the Alternative for Germany, is highest in the old industrial areas, most in need of decarbonisation. So it is fueling resentment in those areas, and it's part what behind the shift to the hard right. So what do we do about that?
Sure, and there is a lot of insecurity, and therefore people are turning away from the government party. But I don't think that the solution now is to say, okay, nothing will change, because the change is not coming because of green policies. The change is coming because we are in a globalized world, and maybe it's not as efficient to produce steel in Germany than it is to than to produce it in India. So therefore, like, there needs to be a case where we would still produce steel in Germany or in the UK. And the case is, first, we want to have it. It is a strategic industry. It's needed because you never know what happens to supply chains. And second, we produce better green steel. So this transformation needs to happen right now, and we're doing it.
Jess, you talked about an industrial strategy. At Davos this week, they've been talking about the return to subsidies. There's a lot of tension over subsidies because, as Ben was suggesting, they look across the pond at the United States, $3.5 trillion of subsidies that the Biden administration has set out. But what's really interesting about that money is that it is largely targeted at brownfield sites, at coal fields, high fossil fuel communities, or communities that depend on old industries. So there is a strategy in the United States, but we don't see it here in the UK.
I think that's fair to say. I think when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, which is what I think you're talking about in the US, they've got a big chunk of, you might call it subsidy, some might call it investment, actually, because what they're doing is putting money into these areas, like you say, who need these jobs to make that transition. And they're investing in the future for that area. And I think that's something that we haven't really seen in the UK. I think, as Michael was hinting at, actually, in Germany, they've transitioned to using hydrogen in some of their plants and create this green steel. We've now done away with our blast furnaces, so we're going to have no ability to make our own virgin steel, new steel. And that means that we're going to have to import more. And I think Michael was hinting at this, but what we've seen over the last 18 months or so with war in Ukraine, various other tensions, tension with China potentially worsening. If we're relying on other countries for these imports, then there's a risk there that we're going to be caught short when the time comes, if something does happen, God forbid.
Yeah, just a really quick one, Michael, because I'm running out of time. But obviously, if there's big subsidies in the United States, that tends to suck a lot of the investment. Are you worried there in Germany that in these areas where you need new industry, you just can't pay the bucks to encourage them to come?
Well, we first need them to stay, but there's a subsidies race happening globally. China has their own industrial strategy. They want to be leading in the new technologies that will be determining the future. US is doing the same. Europe would be naive if they would not do the same and just rely on the open market. So we need to have an industrial strategy. Yeah. We need to make sure and identify those industries that we want to have in Europe that are strategic. And this is the new world.
Yeah. Michael Bloss, Jess Ralston, really good to talk to you. Thank you for coming on the programme. Ben's still here with me. Really interesting, actually, the comparisons and some differences between two big European countries. Yeah. I understand, though, and when it comes to